I don't know if you can see that. But we are now recording, and so anybody who doesn't want to be recorded should turn off your video and say nothing. But we are, I think, ready now to start the formal program, which begins with financial inclusion. And Mary Ellen Iskandarian, the CEO of Women's World Banking, is going to address us for the next 15 minutes. So, Mary Ellen, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, Vint, and thank you, Maylin, for inviting me to be with all of you today. I think I also have one more thank you to Matt for making the introduction to Maylin. So, Vint, I'd say if there's anybody who rivals Maylin in getting people to talk to each other, it would be Matt Gamser. So I think we've got a lot of world-class connectors on this call, which is, seems particularly appropriate for the topic under discussion. I had understood we were going to have somebody project some slides. I don't mean to slavishly focus on them, but they can kind of orient our conversation perhaps.
Well, that was not me. So.
No, it's going to be me. It's going to be me. So, Mary Ellen, just go ahead and I will get it going.
So I thought it might be helpful to just give a brief introduction to my organization, Women's World Banking, then speak a bit about how absolutely critical digital connectivity is to our work, but probably more importantly to the bigger proposition of financial inclusion and women's financial inclusion in particular. And then I'd gotten the sense that there was a great deal of interest in parts of this group in Indonesia for a variety of reasons, not least of which their impending G20 presidency. So I thought we might talk a little bit about the work that we're doing there and how that might actually be part of a G20 offering and then a potentially broader forum for collaboration. So I'm just seeing blank screen here. I don't know if you are actually presenting.
I am presenting.
Yes, we can see.
There we go.
Okay.
Except now it's not in a full screen.
Not in a presentation format.
Okay, I'll go back to doing presentation.
Yeah, that worked. Yes,
there we go.
Okay. 1 billion women in the world lack access to formal financial services. Let's fix that.
Yes, bingo. And that's very much at the heart of Women's World Banking's mission. At least as of the latest data, the Findex data, which hopefully we will be able to, after a year's delay, we'll be able to renew next year. There were still 1.7 billion people in the world without access to formal financial services, and that of that number, fully 1 billion of them are women. So really the disproportionate impact of financial exclusion rests with women. Maybe the next slide, please. And at the heart of that exclusion are two very big gaps, maybe some smaller ones as well, but these are the ones that we just feel we continually, repeatedly have to bang the drum about. This 9 percentage point gender gap in financial access has stayed stubbornly the case for well over a decade. At least that's when the numbers have started to be collected. And it almost seems as if in many countries where digital connectivity, digital financial services have been the major policy tool or private sector tool to drive inclusion, the gender gap has even widened further. And that points directly to that second gap, which actually, frankly, represents very good news. The gender gap in smartphone access closed dramatically during this COVID year. You've seen women's access to internet-enabled cell phone devices dramatically increase, and that's why we're actually as nervous as everyone is about variants and spikes and surges in the uncertainty and the economic uncertainty that COVID represents, it has actually been a bit of a silver lining when it comes to financial inclusion. And there have been a couple of things that have taken place that we're at Women's World Banking very much trying to capitalize on. Now that we've gotten digital devices into women's hands, have them more included in the formal financial sector, how do we keep them there? So maybe just a few words about us. We are a global NGO that was created 42 years ago. And since our founding, our mission has always been dedicated to getting appropriate, affordable, transparent financial services into the hands of low-income women in developing countries. And I'd say for maybe the first 15, 18 years of our 20 years of our existence, that was primarily through microfinance. And we were maybe closest akin to a membership organization for some of the leading microfinance institutions in the world. But in the last 10 to 15 years, as it became so apparent that digital financial services was going to be the way we would deliver last mile services and more broadly financial services to low-income people, the partners with whom we could think about engaging not only expanded far beyond microfinance, but frankly, the microfinance world has been a little slow to recognize the opportunities in digital. And so today we still partner with a very diverse set of financial service providers, but fully a third of them, for example, are fintech companies. We're doing a lot of work, again, particularly related to the last year of COVID with digitizing salaries, digitizing COVID relief payments with e-wallets. We work with several transcontinental banks in Africa, in insurance companies, very broad-based group of institutions, and provide a range of advisory services, helping them design products to reach women, research, an increasing policy and advocacy agenda, and then also this leadership and diversity training that has become a real hallmark of our work, recognizing that there is a close correlation between financial institutions and regulatory bodies that have a critical mass of women in leadership and management and provision of services to women clients. But as the next slide will tell you, this is the area that I'm particularly excited about and have been responsible for really driving our role as an impact investor. We have 2 funds currently under management. One, we're in the process of harvesting those investments and selling off the 10 investments we made in this global fund. We were thrilled that, counter to the trend of most financial inclusion organizations, microfinance and otherwise, that bring in external capital, we've seen a steady increase in the women clients that have been reached by our portfolio companies because of our activist investment policy. The second fund, we had a $75 million first closing last year and have made 4 investments. We're continuing to raise money against a second close at the end of the first quarter of next year. But really interesting sectors. And I think this is really the difference since our launch of 2012 Fund 1 and then last year's launch of Fund 2. We're in affordable housing, insurtech. We've made two fintech investments, a really interesting P2P lender in Indonesia is our largest portfolio company. So a very interesting changing landscape for those institutions that are really seeing women as important clients. Now, perhaps I can just move a little bit to what we are seeing. I've alluded already to seeing, particularly in this COVID environment, digital services sort of trending in a more inclusive direction as we've seen businesses really forced into a digital environment, forced to bring more clients into that kind of engagement when social distancing became impossible. We've also seen a really interesting trend. While we may all be bemoaning the double burden that women have faced as jobs have come back home, as kids now have come back home, we've also seen women's understanding of technology really take a lead in the household as they've had to get up to speed with remote learning with their kids. And as I mentioned before, just stunning drop in that gender gap in internet-enabled phone access. But we still really struggle with the lack of basic access to digital financial services, and maybe even more importantly, even when the access is available. And I briefly saw there was a question in the chat that I think this answer speaks to, is that their comfort, their financial capability, their digital capability, their comfort in handling the technology with confidence. There's a lot of research that shows, the first app that a woman will open if she gets an internet-enabled phone, it tends to be WhatsApp, and then she never makes any step beyond that. She doesn't explore the internet more widely and isn't really comfortable navigating the full range of options available to her. And then that is always just compounded with a lack of understanding of how a woman's need or an understanding or being marketed to even by a financial service provider with a financial product is just dramatically understood. There's a dramatic lack of understanding. It is still, and gentlemen, I do apologize because I don't think we accomplish anything by bashing, but it's still very much products designed by men for men, and not really understanding how the equation might be different for women. Milind, thank you for taking us back to Indonesia. So as I mentioned, this is a very important market for us. It's one of our 6 priority countries. It is really unique amongst the organizations that the countries that we're working in today, in that it was a place where we really didn't have much of a portfolio or a profile in the private sector or even the state-owned sector banks with financial service providers, but we were very engaged in helping the government design and then implement a financial inclusion strategy. So it was a bit of a reverse relationship with us. We had quite close relationships with the interministerial agency that was leading the strategy, and now with OJK and BI and several of the other, Bappenas, some of the other government agencies that are now implementing the strategy. And we're absolutely thrilled that the Indonesian government recognized, as many governments are slower to do, that their overarching financial inclusion goals will not be reachable if they don't take specifically women's financial inclusion into consideration. And so together, partnering with the Asian Development Bank and a few other actors, we've had a deep engagement in helping the government recognize what some of its strategies and tactics need to be in order to reach more women. I'd like to just, in the 2 minutes left to me, just a couple of in the next slides. Why don't we go on from that? Just a couple of the projects that we've been very deeply engaged with have been, as the previous slide that I suggested we skip over indicated, we were very engaged with helping the government move one of its most longest standing conditional cash transfer programs, the PKH program, which was primarily dedicated to women recipients, and transforming that into a COVID relief payment. Quite successful. It was already digitized, but as always, seems to be the last thing anyone thinks about is the messaging to the recipients on how that change might have taken place. We were brought in almost on an emergency basis to help with the financial education, the messaging to not only the women themselves, but the ambassadors in the village who were working on disseminating the payments. And one of the fascinating things we learned is so many of the women quickly realized that they were now receiving more money more frequently than they had under the Pequeja program. And they were interested in saving. They recognized that this pandemic may go on for a while. They wanted that safety net, and they didn't really understand that they actually had an underlying bank account that they could be saving in. They were very concerned, and we often find this, they were very concerned about confidentiality, that if they wanted to save, they didn't necessarily want their husbands to know that that money had been saved and was not being spent. So some of our more traditional product development work really came in handy in an emergency situation. And then one of the other projects that we've been very excited about is a remittance solution for women migrant workers working in Indonesia, as well as in some of the important remittance corridors in and out of Indonesia. The thing we like about this, we're working with a really exciting fintech company called Dana, one of the larger wallets in Indonesia. Very excited about the fact that it's not just about making that payment, but about building the broader ecosystem, getting the employers to digitize their salary so that the payment can stay sort of within the system. So this is relatively new, but we're quite excited about the possibilities. And then one last project that I just thought I'd give because it's kind of fun to see a comic. We were working with another fintech that was providing supplier credit to small women-owned businesses. And, unfortunately, we found very, very quickly that they liked the idea of credit. They liked the idea of getting credit from the supplier and within the supply chain that they were already engaged in, but their lack of financial understanding, their lack of digital understanding, because that was one of the highlights of this, that could all be digitized, was really holding them back. And so we designed with the company a series of sort of comic books to explain exactly how the process worked. And unfortunately, we got the whole thing up and running just as the first shutdown took place. Hopefully, as the economy sort of revs back up again, we'll see a greater uptake of credit through this program. So I think that brings us that brings us to the close of the presentation. And all I might just say is because of that original relationship with the government, we've already been consulted quite extensively by several of the participating ministries about a G20 engagement. As May-Lin well knows, the Minister of Finance is very keen on highlighting women's entrepreneurship, women's economic empowerment through their presidency. We had, as many of you know, the Saudi presidency may have been a little frustrating in a number of ways, but we were very proud to have partnered with several organizations, even in that environment, to promote how digital finance could be empowering for women. And I think the Indonesians are eager to ride that wave and even take it further. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much, Vince.
Thank you very much, Mary Ellen. I know there are a number of comments in the chat, but we don't have time to respond to them right this moment. May-Lin, if there is time later in this session to come back to questions for Mary Ellen and others, let's do that.
Great. And I can always follow up afterwards. So thank you very much.
Thank you for that. You might leave your email in the chat, Mary Ellen, so people can get to you directly.
Super.
You mentioned ecosystem, which I think is a very apt term to use, especially given our next speaker's title, Kenya's Evolving Digital Ecosystem, and this is Brian Omwanga. So Brian, let's pursue that because it's a focus on a particular place, Kenya, and its adaptation to high tech, which has been ongoing for quite some time. So I'm very curious to hear where we are with that.
Very true, very true. Thank you very much, May-Lin, for the invitation. It's quite a great pleasure to meet a lot of you, very heavy names in the industry. So it's also quite an honor. May-Lin, should I share my slides?
Yes, please share your slides.
All right, so I'll just share a window here. All right, please let me know when you can see something.
We're not seeing anything yet. Here we go. It's coming up now. And we see background. You might want to go full screen if you can.
All right, there we go.
Yes.
All right.
Perfect.
All right, good. I think, Maylene, you gave me about 15 minutes, so I'll probably just try to.
Yes, that is correct. You have 15 minutes.
Good.
We're running. Oh, Brian, you might just, I didn't introduce you very well, but you might just say what your role is at Think.
All right, so I'm currently the founder and team lead at Think, but that introduction is indeed going to come out simply because when we're looking at ecosystems, one of the primary beliefs I have about ecosystems is that it's the sum total of each individual's view of that ecosystem. It happens to be different for absolutely everyone who's engaged within that ecosystem. So if you want to really have a holistic understanding of that ecosystem, you have to take the sum of each and every individual, the academia, the market, and absolutely everyone. So to me, that is the real challenge. It's actually based off of writings of Malherbe. And I think that is going to be the basis of what I present, because the evolution of this ecosystem is almost the evolution of my own work around it. So if you allow me, I'll just head to the first slide, which then gives you a background or a little bit of what we would call the story. Just a second, it just decided to jump all over. All right, so a little bit of a story of my engagement with with this ecosystem. All right, did it just?
I'm sorry to interrupt, Brian, but your slides are dancing automatically.
Yeah, it seems like they're on some form of animation, but I'll have to just. All right, do that now. I hope it.
Brian, if you want, I can share. If shall I share so that you don't have to worry?
All right, please do, please do. Right,
okay, you just keep talking. I will share.
Oh, he has to
all right,
stop
good.
First, yeah. Okay.
I have. All right, so by form of background, I actually did my graduate studies out at MIT in the engineering systems division, where I actually looked at broadband. So at around that time, a very interesting gentleman by the name of Bitangen Demo, who was one of our IT leaders here, had gotten the first kind of optic fiber cable to land on the east coast of Africa, and it actually landed in Kenya, and that was the rave at that time. So actually, I decided to then do my master's around analyzing broadband deployment for economic development, and I did this with a framework that was one of my supervising professor had come up with this whole transportation system framework called the CLIOS for the optimization of the deployment of transportation systems in cities. And basically, he had this whole kind of system dynamic driven framework that would look at the optimal movement of people and goods. So I decided to then take his framework and apply that framework to broadband, which involved first defining broadband as a transportation system, and then figuring out what elements these are within broadband that contribute to economic development, which then led me to the summary of the movement of data and the movement of programmable business services. So data, of course, in the form of knowledge, and programmable business services in anything that you would term as digitization or digitalization. And then, of course, optimizing that. So that was generally what I worked on, and ended up, I think at that time, those were really the seminal moments of ecosystem discussion, and got to understand that the deployment of broadband is actually beyond connectivity. It actually goes into a lot of other things that need to be deployed together with it for purposes of obtaining advantage from it. Around that time, of course, what happened is the narrative of Kenya as Silicon Savannah happened. You saw an explosion of what are called tech hubs, and the interesting thing is, from that very moment, around that time of 2009, there was an incredible innovation in Kenya called M-Pesa, which is digital money. And ever since 2007 until now, it has been extremely difficult in Kenya to get an innovation that has scaled to the size of M-Pesa. And that really got me thinking as to, is it really just connectivity? What exactly are these challenges? And essentially that landed me on ecosystemic challenges. They're actually serious ecosystemic challenges in terms of this deployment. So beyond that, then I started doing a bit of research into ecosystems, and along the way got involved in enterprise architecture. Enterprise architecture introduced me into what you would call the delivery of, let's say, large-scale IT for purposes of achieving, enterprise goals. I undertook the enterprise architecture for the Ministry of Health here in Kenya, and it's gained a few awards. It actually got the TOGAF award, the President's Award for it, and the government therefore asked me to then look at the entire government enterprise architecture, which became something extremely interesting. But one thing that came out from all of that conversation is this element of a middleware, and the importance of the middleware in terms of really unifying a lot of service delivery, which I found to be extremely interesting. And this enterprise architecture concept got me thinking about ecosystem delivery, and whether it is possible to deliver this ecosystem virtually, which then ended up becoming something that I started studying within my PhD. And I also kind of, at the initial stages, did write 1 or 2 papers, one of which was accepted at ACM on the designing the ultimate tech hub, which essentially is the basis of creating this middleware for the delivery of data and the delivery of business services. One other thing that then became very clear at that time is the key problem of scaling, particularly in Africa, is that you're dealing with different countries, but you're also dealing with very different markets. And those markets represent ecosystems that are at extremely different levels of maturity. And the concept of maturity models around ecosystems then became something that needed to be brought into the conversation. So it's definitely important to understand where the maturity of an ecosystem has reached before you actually deploy certain solutions. This became very interesting because you find, like in Kenya, for instance, an innovation like Twiga Foods, which got a lot of funding. Twiga Foods is an innovation around the distribution of agricultural produce from farmers to markets. So they then received quite a bit of seed funding, only to realize that for them to actually scale to the whole country, the next problem is that the farmers actually need financing. So then the next series of funding that they receive is to try and solve the financing problem of the farmers. And this brings up something very interesting. I think one of the seminal writers on something called technology amplification, Kentaro Toyama, kept talking about. That sometimes when you deploy one technology solution, it actually shows you where the real problem is or where the other problems are. But is it better to actually approach this from a holistic perspective, where we actually say, look, we're bringing an entire middleware or an entire ecosystem that can then try and address all these problems holistically? So then that became the question, and that is precisely what I'm attempting to do right now. So that's what I'm calling the Tech Innovators Network. So something very interesting about the delivery of that ecosystem or the delivery of that middleware is that you have to partner with the local tech community. That is almost imperative. And as happened during the pandemic, I actually realized that every single individual has what you would call a digital advisor, in a way. Like my mom, wherever she was, had to call my small brother to come and install Zoom on her machine. And that happens. Everyone actually has a digital companion. And this digital companion is always local because they understand the needs a lot better. So one important element of this is people. And that is at the heart and at the root of it, creating a trusted community with the local tech. Then you take a look at the technology stack, which in this particular case needs to be delivered through enterprise architecture for reasons such as middleware and taking advantage of, if you'd call it enterprise-related, economies of scale or reuse of tools. And then, of course, the maturity of the marketplace. This is also particularly for matters of sustainability. I can see I have about 4 to 3 minutes. So this essentially is what the Tech Innovators Network tries to bring together for purposes of delivery. And I believe that deploying such a Tech Innovators Network across the whole of Africa is something that can then manage to unify digital delivery on top of connectivity such that you can scale any solution across. Because if you need to go to, let's say, Ghana, you need to interact with the Ghana technology community if you want to, use Ghana digital money or something like that. So that is one of the key elements in terms of I really think that community-driven partnerships between people, technology, and markets is an integral middleware for purposes of accompanying connectivity. So here in Kenya, what we've managed to achieve very quickly, we've decided to create our tech community around a savings and credit cooperative. So we've actually formalized the tech community as a cooperative. The cooperative has about 150 members right now. We've also done an agreement with the private sector for access to the market. We've done partnerships with a few local regulators, and we've also partnered with large multinationals like the Google My Business program for us to see whether we can assist in working with local businesses as well. We've worked with EcoBank, but interestingly enough, on the other side, based on the technology stack, we've deployed about 5 solutions that we think are useful for connecting the businesses. But beyond this, of course, still doing a lot of study. It's evolutionary. So as we keep working, we keep building. Final slide, please. So. So together with this, just some very quick highlights. So we got highlighted by the latest ILO report on platform labor, simply because we also understood that a lot of the local tech communities will do these projects as gigs. And if they're doing these projects as gigs, the labor around gig is is not very formalized. So by the mere fact that they're held together in this cooperative, it's possible to deploy amenities around that as well. There's the SCM Dev paper on the Tech Hub design, and then at the beginning of this year, we did a presentation at IST Africa as well. Just a very quick shout out. So the technology stack itself will have some elements that can be run commercially using a business model, but there are elements of it that will generally need to have some form of support. So we've got a little bit of support from GIZ and Clear Global in terms of building AI for its navigation. It's very interesting here that there's a conversation about apps, and the truth is, you can't really download and install 100 apps onto your phone. The truth here is, can you get a digital companion who can help you navigate to an app that is actually of your particular need? And that's precisely why we opened up an AI discussion and the ability to build an AI ecosystem as well. We're doing something around IDs as well, distributed IDs, because you're also looking at different ecosystems for purposes of unifying that. If you have a middleware, you're probably looking at Estonia's X-Road, so something fairly similar to that. And of course, all this is driven by big data. So trying to also start up an open data program and discussion. So generally, this is what we're doing. This is what we're doing at Think. We believe that the deployment of technology has to be in partnership with the ground. I'll echo what the ILO report was saying, that there's an alternative to platform capitalism, and the alternative is platform cooperativism. And we believe that we have a model that can exhibit effectively platform cooperativism, and working on that every day and seeing whether we can get some good results. And any support and comments from you is definitely very welcome. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Brian. We're running over time. I see Gora has his hand up. If you can perhaps ask your question tersely, Gora, we can at least know what the question is, although we may have to take the answer offline.
Sure, thanks. Yeah, no, this is of a longer discussion, but my point which I'm making is the unique IDs, when you're talking about identification, needs to go beyond the device itself. It has to be up to the instance of the app or the person. So there are complexities, but I just wanted to alert that, and happy to have more conversation on that later.
Point well taken. I would say standards are very important here for success, and so is fungibility if we're going to do anything about transferring value around. These multiple crypto coins are worrying me because they look like the 18th century in the United States, where every bank had its own script and everybody had to worry about what the translation was, exchange rates were. Kate Wilson is joining us, and she was just on the previous ITU call. She's CEO of Digital Impact Alliance, and we're going to hear from her about GovStack, which is relevant in some respects to what Brian was talking about when it comes to having technology in people's hands. So Kate, I see you're ready to go, so the floor is yours.
Kate, is it the microphone problem again?
We don't hear you.
We can't hear you.
Let's see, can I?
So,
Kate, can we hear you now? Well, let's see, it's funny because it doesn't look like you're muted, but for some reason it didn't work before.
Kate, if it helps, I'll share and you can speak. I think you used a different microphone earlier and that seemed to work that second time.
Can you hear that okay?
Oh, yeah.
Now
Yeah,
we can hear
we're
you.
just changing around microphones apparently today.
Wow. Okay.
Okay, not the best microphone, but hopefully it will work. All right, let's go back to sharing screen. First, I just want to say how impressed, Brian, I was by your presentation. I found that it was incredibly helpful, and it actually dovetails really nicely with what I'm about to talk about. So this is an effort. So I am one of 4 of the partners who has the joy of talking about GovStack, but it really ties in so closely to what Brian was really just discussing. What are the challenges for a government in terms of trying to figure out the middleware and basically make all of the pieces that they need sort of interoperable? How do you bring community engagement into that? And how do you truly have sort of a whole of society approach? And how do we really navigate all together as a global community, as every single one of us is trying to, you know, achieve digital transformation? There's no real blueprint for that. And we're all struggling with what works and how do we connect it all together. So this is a more formalized presentation that the partners have developed. Again, those partners for GovStack are the Republic of Estonia, the German government, the ITU, and the Digital Impact Alliance. So today I'm following on sort of an earlier presentation that David Roos from Germany gave a couple of months ago on GovStack, and try and encourage engagement from this group to try and get you all closer involved. It's quite a long and lengthy presentation. I'm going to try and do the condensed version, and we can share with you sort of the full deck, and would encourage all of you to think about how you can get engaged. So we want to just talk about 4 basic things. What was motivated? Why are we trying to do this? What's the concept overall? What's our overall approach to do this? And try and get you all to join us as we shape this. So let's first talk about the motivation. As all of us know, developing countries, and really countries in general, are on this progressive pathway to digitize service delivery. But as Vin and I were just on the sort of last call, you know, we still have 50% of the people who are not connected. 18% in people in Africa can actually get connected to broad-scale broadband. And governments are really struggling with how do we actually coordinate all of the ICT ministry work across many disparate sectors. How do we deal with the siloed investments that are actually funding things deeply in health, or funding things over here in education, or funding things in agriculture, bring those together? Is there sufficient financing to actually build out both the connectivity infrastructure, that physical infrastructure, the digital public infrastructure, the public goods that really fuel the whole of government approach? And then, as Brian was talking about, the applications that then might run on top of those, but really opening up that ecosystem so that local innovators, wherever they may be based, can actually deliver and create new services. I always think about this as how do you create the enabling infrastructure so that great new experiences can be created on top of it. So looking at doing all of that and then scaling it, these are some of the challenges that we're all facing. All governments are really grappling with this. This whole range of problems that are presented here. What GovStack is really trying to look at specifically is the lack of interoperability frameworks and systems that currently exist, and understand how we can do work as a global community to bring efforts together to try and address that problem, to connect these individual building blocks. So what's the concept? So let's talk a bit about building blocks. Many different ways of framing this. In tech sector, we call it microservices, how you're bringing together these individual components. But David had showed you a couple of months ago this set of Lego building blocks. It's not dissimilar to that. Every government, and going back to Brian's maturity model, has to implement certain sets of building blocks in order to take a whole of government approach to digital infrastructure. Then those building blocks then can connect to individual sectoral solutions. Challenge right now is that many of those sectoral solutions exist, but they don't necessarily have this accompanying back end. So working with the ITU, starting in 2016, we began mapping across individual enterprise architectures that existed by sectors to identify what were common building blocks that existed no matter what sector that you had. The characteristics of these are they're reusable, they're software components that already exist, there are COTS and digital public goods that are available to do this. they can facilitate a number of generic operational workflows, and they can become interoperable with other building blocks. We believe strongly that across sectors and government agencies that you can reuse many of these common digital components to actually build an integrated back-end infrastructure that can actually tie and enable workflows and ultimately help achieve overall the SDGs. So we encourage you to start from the building blocks, not from the SDG, to look at what are the digital solutions. Fundamentally, this device was not built solely for a sector. It was built to enable many great experiences or solve many big problems. So we're encouraging you to look at what these building blocks are and then figure out how to connect them together. These building blocks can be used to create one digital platform to deliver various government services digitally. And it should be said that it's really about enabling, through the development of these foundational building blocks, new common applications and mediation middleware that can then sit on top of it. We believe fundamentally that this whole of government digital platform can be used by any government agency across sectors. I want to be very careful, though, to say here, we do not believe in one monolithic platform. We think that there are various solutions that can be knit together that will be designed by the government, and for their citizens, with citizens and civil society input. But we think it's really critical that we start testing how to actually plug together many of the components that actually already exist. We believe that fundamentally utilizing this reusable stack will actually deliver a wide range of benefits, some of which, you know, people are have discussed even on this, is like, how do we make things more efficient? We were talking about Estonia earlier. I was in Estonia last week. You know, how do you encourage agility and responsiveness? How do you make this cost effective? How do you ensure that there's integration and exchange? And fundamentally, in their case, how do you really ensure that there is trust in the systems that are being built so that there is truly a citizen and government interaction to this? So what's our approach, and how and then we'll talk about how we hope you all can join us. So first, this is a joint initiative that is really community-driven, community-led, and community designed. So our hope is that we can simplify some of the technical approaches that go into building this holistic digital government, and then we can really accelerate countries' ownership and design and improvement of whatever is come up with as individual reference architectures. It started from, as I mentioned, this work that we did on the SDG Digital Investment Framework. I encourage many of you to take a look at that. We started that work to really advocate to governments to take this approach. The initiative has three main strategic areas that it is working on. First and foremost, right now we're looking at specifying. How do you develop and evolve specifications for high priority building blocks, and then illustrating how they can actually be put together. Second is really demonstrations. How do you bring together products and approaches and develop working reference models that can highlight how the illustrative stack put together can actually work? And third is really engaging pilot countries. For example, our colleagues in Germany have announced sort of efforts in terms of the Horn of Africa initiative. We're working with the government of Sierra Leone regarding their digital transformation agenda, and so they're interested in also looking into this. But really, none of these things become real until governments have actually started to engage and kick the tires on it. And only then is it really designed with the user in mind. The next 2 years, we'll be focusing on the following areas, and I want to talk about this. So first, phase one is really this reference architecture. Phase two is then moving into procurement to solicit services and really demonstrate one of the first applications of this GovStack model. And phase three is really setting up and demonstrating this model in direct engagement with individual governments themselves. Interest and commitment to adopting this is already being started, as I mentioned, in partnership with Smart Africa, but also in discussions with Sierra Leone. The Horn of Africa initiative, commitment from the government, German Development Cooperation is already looking to support individual pieces. And so here's just some examples of some of the areas where there is interest, but we see that growing. And if there are countries representatives who join this call, we'd certainly love to hear from you as well. This is currently being driven by an interim governance structure that has each of the colleagues joined. And we're really inviting people in the community, including this group, to actually tangibly join us and work in one of these 5 areas. We have a coordinating body. This is the founding members. We met last week to essentially walk through and set the overall roadmap. We have a technical advisory group, which is currently been constructed and is currently being set up, an architectural working group that is developing the architectural blueprints and really looking at interoperability, and building block working groups that are already engaged, that are already deep and pull from sector experience that already exists. So for example, in ID and authentication, it's really drawing deeply on the work that the World Bank has been leading in terms of the ID4D program as an example, as well as coordinating with colleagues at MOSIP, and then on financial services as an example, tying into the work that Mojo Loop has been doing. So this is really trying to help bring together and connect the partners who already exist, not replicate something else. We're really looking at how this can be tied towards longer term adoption and sustainability of the models. And so that really is tied around how do we accelerate this by working directly with targeted countries to learn from approaches that have already been taken, but also test and adapt and change. Second is really to connect. What are the additional building blocks that are really required, and how do we enable more use cases than where we may start? And finally, and most importantly from my perspective, is really how do we replicate and sustain this? This fundamentally has to be an effort that isn't just started with a group of excited people who see the problem and want to connect it, but really how do you develop kind of a long-term approach to this that everyone can adopt and mobilize and unify around? And that is why we think the community level of partnership is so key in this. The founding partners, each of us have distinct roles at this point in time. So our colleagues from Germany are really driving donor harmonization. Our colleagues at the ITU are really enabling much of the country capacity. Estonia is helping us in terms of bringing in their knowledge and expertise from their experience of running this to really help set what is the possibilities for a future eGov vision. But we invite other visionary government leaders to join us as well, such as those from South Korea, Singapore, Kenya, Rwanda, many places around the globe. There are so many great examples to pull from, and each of you have done this in a different way, and really learning from your examples is going to be what's key. And what Dial's role is to help with some of the ecosystem alignment and help with sort of putting together some of the communication roadmaps and pieces that help make this real. With our GovStack model in place, we see the types of challenges that can really be addressed in terms of digital transformation, including this lack of sometimes updated and comprehensive national ICT plans, limited coordination of ICT strategy, and sometimes the challenges of ineffective governance and really investing in some of the digital policy efforts that we need. In order for that to happen, we know that we must also help address and align people around the financing and procurement for ICT projects that is really starting to affect much of this. That gets fixed, that helps affect many of the technical challenges that we already face. So how can people join us? So partners each take a different role, as I sort of outlined.
Kate,
Yep.
Kate, I'm sorry to interrupt. I want to give Vint just a
Yeah,
couple
so sorry.
minutes before he leaves, and then you can continue after. Vint, go ahead.
Oh, well, thank you. I didn't intend to interrupt the presentation from Kate, but one thing I would say in the chat, there are 2 things I worry greatly about. One is standardization, and the other one is maintaining interoperability over long periods of time, which is a general problem. And if we have new operating systems come along, the building blocks don't run on the new operating systems. How are we going to maintain that? What do we do about the interoperability over many different instances of operating systems and things like that? So there are technical challenges associated with this, in addition to all of the other coordination and collaboration challenges that are obvious. I see that one answer on standardization is that ITU and maybe May-Lin suggested IEEE and ISO could be part of the standardization activity. That's going to be very important. So I don't know whether, Kate, you have any immediate responses, but I only have about 30 seconds left before I have to jump on another call. So let me
Yeah,
just
no problem.
everybody.
At all. So it is deeply an area. The issues of standardization and how to tie this together is a critical part of this. You can't obviously stand up these reference architectures without starting to look into that. It is a part, and that is in part why the ITU's role is so key. We do believe that the two things are intrinsically related and are looking constantly for how to bring that together and drive it in. The conversation about standards is a core part of this.
Not surprising. All right, I'm going to hand off to Mei-Lin now, and thank you all for joining. I hope this works. If
Everyone else, stay on.
This is a test. This will be a test. If this were an emergency, we'd all run for the basement. So have a great rest of the day and rest of the week. Thanks a bunch. Bye for now.
It worked. Phew. Back to you, Kate.
No problem. So I just had really 1 to 2 more slides to go through, so I don't want to take up too much time by talking too much, but just in general, here are many ways for different groups to participate, and so I would encourage you all to reach out to me, or in particular, reach out to info@govstack.global to join the community and figure out how you can help bring all of the knowledge and wisdom that's in place. Brian, I was already pinging a colleague. We're very interested in how we actually connect to this with the innovators network that you had already set up, because we do think that that combination is what's going to be really critical for this, because it has to be driven directly from innovators on the ground. Thank you.
Thank you, Kate. You covered so much material.
I did speed round.
The slides are in the agenda, which is in the chat. So thank you, Kate. And really, this Digital Cooperation Diplomacy series is for us to have this sort of face-to-face connection, to understand people doing related things. And with that, I want to bring forward Tamara Singh, who has newly joined the People-Centered Internet as our treasurer. She's based in Singapore. She was the Senior Vice President for Public Market Operations for GIC, Singapore's Sovereign Wealth Fund. Over to you, Tamara.
Thanks, Mei-Lin, and let me just get my screen up. Is that appearing, please? Can I just check that you can hear me and see me? Okay, awesome. And I have to say thank you, Kate, because you actually did a lot of the heavy lifting for me, as did Mary Ellen and Brian before me. So as you can see, what I'm likely to speak about for the next 15 minutes is really the idea of a building block. And it's really a building block that supports MSME growth during the recovery cycle that we're looking towards. I'm going to go quite quickly because the slides will be shared. And so what I'm going to do is go at quite a high level and take time for questions as they come up. I can't see the screen, so I will rely on someone to shout them out to me. So the punchline really is that when we look at the ecosystem today, much as Brian did, what we found was a very similar problem. We found that because of the competitive behaviors in the economies today, many people compete really on data acquisition, who has the most access and scale, rather than not necessarily the value they provide. And so looking at the ecosystem and trying to think about how we can nudge the kind of behaviors that would help us further the SDGs, we had a few ideas that we're going to put forward, and they really echo the sentiments that you've heard today from Women's World Banking, who have hands-on experience, and from, of course, Kate's work now building the building blocks. So some people have asked me, having come from a sovereign wealth fund where I'm really typically focused on large businesses, why the focus is on MSMEs. And the answer to that is, frankly, we can't survive without them. The vast majority of the employment opportunities and the support for our economies comes from the smaller businesses that exist. There are obviously statistics on the page right now around the gap in the access to capital that formal MSMEs face. The informal economy is obviously much trickier. Now, the conversation around MSMEs is not one that's new. It's been going for some time, and it seems to me that pretty much everyone is aligned behind it. UNESCO have identified it, G20 have identified it, ASEAN have focused on it, and even private organizations are jumping the gun to take their own initiatives. One of the less commonly referred to organizations in this space is Facebook. They put $100 million into issuing loans to small businesses globally in 2017, and more recently, $4 million just into India alone. So the problem is recognized and it exists. And I think one of the questions we have here on the call always is, what is making this so hard and how can we help? And so one of the challenges with MSMEs is that it's a double-sided supply and demand issue. Ultimately, though, it comes down to data. So what we're proposing as people-centered internet is a way forward where we try and create, as Brian also had, self-sustaining data repositories was the term that Kate had, that will enable real-time affordable access to data that's been verified, that's been reasonably validated. And that will help to address the majority of the barriers in place today. Now, this slide actually links them back one by one to show how every single barrier that's been identified through years of studies could be quite readily addressed, assuming this model works. But this model itself is not going to be a shock, because if we think about it, the vision of MSMEs gaining increased cheaper finance, the objectives of something being around creating trusted, verified data that's accessible and shared, but made available on equal terms so that the focus of the users of that data will be on value creation. We think that there'll be clear outcomes around lending increase, access to avenues for growth of businesses as they're able to sort of fulfill their own growth needs, lenders gaining access to secondary markets if needed to help move the risk from their local bank balance sheets, as one example, so that they can give increased capacity to the people on the ground. And of course, one of the things that helps when we think about the education and literacy aspects, we can help guide the MSMEs towards sustainable practices themselves, not just from a financial perspective, but also in terms of the SDGs, as we can help aid their transition journeys. So what you see here is a new way forward. It's a new way to enable MSMEs to grow and develop by delivery of digital public good. Now, some of the ideas we saw before may sound out there and crazy, but actually some of that's already been achieved. The most well-known example, of course, is Alipay, who had 1 billion users, most of whom had insufficient bank credit records, no credit cards. They had 80 million merchants, and they were able to create a sustainable micro and small business lending business out of that. Now, this model really looks at doing something quite similar, but without one organization at its hub. This is the pool of many people's information. What Alipay's experience proved, though, is that once you have the data at scale, what you can do is reduce your cost to serve, increase your scale of business in terms of the lending. You can guide people towards literacy and inclusion. And you can also, through things like what they did with Alipay Ant Forest, move forward into things like reducing carbon footprints of those organizations, while providing, of course, access to global financing as they did with Ant Financial. This is familiar because I think Kate had something very, very similar, and it's actually the same model. The reason the very top pink box is gray, is sort of transparent and gray, though, is the focus here is not on taking over the entire ecosystem, because people are good at what they're good at. This is really about helping them be greater. So this is about pulling together the information available so that they can focus on value on their end, but in our case, help to get the data needed for those who are least able to produce it on their own, and to least able to make it widely available. Now, this concept is in itself supported by proven technologies. And what we want to do is show how a model can be created to help people get there. So the example you have on the screen is a model of around how potentially the data utility itself could be made to be self-sustaining. So as Brian mentioned, there are commercial enterprises, and the utility itself is not actually designed to be one. The idea that it's run essentially as a nonprofit to help sustain itself, keep reinvesting, and meet future requirements, particularly around cybersecurity and protections of peoples. However, that in itself doesn't make it something that that requires funding for eternity. The model that you've seen here, that is an example only, it's a proven example. I'll come to how it's been proven out later on. But essentially, the people who contribute data receive rebates against their end consumption of that data. And people may pay to access the data should they so require it. This is how I hope to show that every single component part has been proven. So what you can see here is a story really around every single piece that we identified as the hardest problems. So for example, MSMEs becoming educated in terms of digital and financial literacy, that's something that's been proven out by Olam Direct, a Singapore firm. They have over 700,000 smallholder farmers across the Middle East, Africa, and Asia, who at FarmGate are loading data to their agricultural production, likely cost of goods and similar, so that they can receive support as they require. Digital literacy and taking people upstream has been proven out in Singapore, where the IMDA has the Information and Media Communications Authority has the SME Go Digital program, where they have led 75,000 SMEs to adopt digital tools, really enterprise software and very basic bookkeeping solutions. Data aggregation has recently been launched, quite excitingly for me, because it happened on my birthday, in India through Account Aggregator. And I think Malin put it in the chat earlier that we would be hearing from them in the next round. What they've shown is that financial information providers can come together and gather their data and make that available for use. That business model I showed earlier, which shows the circularity of the model, now that's something that was proven out by Swift. So Swift, of course, is set up as a cooperative structure where it's a membership with a rebate model. Secondary markets, Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, that's how they essentially started out. And there are, of course, other examples. The use of carbon as a potential use case in secondary markets has also been proven out recently as carbon certifications are getting stronger. Now, I'm conscious that I'm going quite fast, and I'm sorry I went backwards, but I wanted to just highlight that we made some key assumptions in this, but most of these have already been called out today. So we talked about the need for a system where not only specific use cases are covered, but it has to be made broad, interoperable, adoptable by many. We talked about the need for security, and what our standard has been in our assumptions is that at the minimum, it has to meet the requirements placed upon the financial institutions of the country in which this is deployed. We focus a lot on public partnership, and that's because we believe that you need a public and private to come together in collaboration, as Brian suggested, to make this work. We talked about the need to enable MSMEs, and that's because we need to access those least served, not those who already have the smartphone in their hand, but how we can help those who do not yet get on that bandwagon and into this journey. We talked about the secondary services. So when we think about how this utility is going to be used in the model, we do not want to go into that transparent box, which is the provision of the interoperability super app navigator, because that's something that can be done better than us by commercial endeavors. But what we hope is that, of course, those services come on board, plug into the system, and maintain the protocols that have been highlighted earlier. And scalability. This has to be duplicable at a protocol level, talking about the standards that we just touched on before. And so there are, of course, risks to any proposal. It will not be easy by any means. Getting the data up to the right standards and the right quality, maintaining the security and those protocols. We talked about the need for political alliances and public partnership. That always has a little bit of vulnerability in terms of changing policy measures that may come up. We spoke about legal and regulatory risk. And of course, once we're collecting that much information, there is always a risk to any utility of that kind. There is, of course, also the risk of human behaviors or mispurposement of that data, and how we protect the data and fingerprint it as it goes through the system. And then, of course, there is, of course, the risk that the model may not work, that even though component parts have been proven, putting them together become tricky, that perhaps there will be a lack of adoption in the long term, or that data localization requirements mean that we won't be able to quite achieve what we're hoping for. And so that's why what we're trying to do next is get towards a feasibility study, excuse me, so that we can delve into this and think about who the best partners will be before we go into the demonstration, the pilot, and then apply it to go to scale. I'm going to stop there and hand back.
Thank you, Tamara. It's just delightful that us people-centered internet to have a chance to tell you all about what we've been doing. And Tamara is a very able leader on our side, having spent so many years with the GIC and in Singapore. We are running out of time, so let's move quickly on to our next presenter, Matt Gamsa. Is that correct? Do I have that right, Matt?
That's right, and I'm trying to share my screen, and it says,
okay?
But it's not letting me share. Do you have to give me a status to do that? It's grayed in the share item.
Okay, what I suggest is you email it to me and I will share, and then you can, Tamara was able to share.
I don't know what's going on, but for some reason I don't have I've got the screen to share my screen, but oh, hold on, maybe it'll work now. So hopefully you are seeing my screen.
Yep.
And are you seeing it in full screen view?
Yes.
Okay, so, and it's of course at the back end of my presentation. So, hi, I'm Matt Gamsa. For those who don't know me, I work at the IFC, the private sector arm of the World Bank, where I've been for 16 and a half years. I was 25 years in the private sector before then. My presentation's a bit awkward because to some extent you should have heard me before you heard Tamara, because a lot of the things that I'm going to talk about Tamara went over, but I'm maybe going to give them to you in a little bit different way. I want to talk about how digitalization is key to making the world's small and medium enterprises, and micro enterprises for that matter, if you want to use that term, fit for the future. I am speaking though as not as a representative of the World Bank Group. So please, no one from this conversation go and say the World Bank said this or that. I can speak as the head of the SME Finance Forum, and I'll explain a bit about what that is. Now, the SME Finance Forum was created by the G20 countries, and it's managed by us at the IFC. It's, think of it as a marriage broker and cheerleader for the financial sector to help it do a better job of giving small, medium, and micro enterprises around the world better access to finance. And we do that through building a network of banks, fintechs, non-bank financial institutions, microfinance institutions, development banks, and increasingly more, who are united not by where they live, because they live all over the place, not by what their legal status, because that's all over the place too, but they all work with SMEs, they want to work with more, and they want to do a better job of helping SMEs. And principally, as marriage broker and cheerleader, we help our members learn from each other, link to new business opportunities, and to lead the industry voice in high-level dialogue with the G20 and other important bodies. And I should mention that before I go on, that Indonesia becomes president of the G20 country in December. They're already hard at work thinking about an agenda which is going to have financial inclusion as very, very high. And that the G20 was very wise back in 2008 when it first formed in the teeth of the financial crisis and started working on financial inclusion, that it decided that SMEs had to be a part of this, because why are you including folks? And in general, you're including them with financial services because you want to help them be better off. And if you do that without thinking about small business, which is the main employer, the main provider of essential goods and services, and the main provider of innovation in most markets in the world, you're not going to be really thinking about inclusion in the right way. But, and here's where the but comes in, SMEs have historically, pre-COVID, post-COVID, doesn't matter, they've been a problem for the financial world. You've already heard in several presentations, excellent presentations, that access to finance becomes a key stumbling block when you're trying to do things substantial. Well, to some extent, that's been SME's fault, and to some extent, it's been the system's fault. What's SME's fault? I mean, this is what SMEs really look like to financiers. They're not very ordered. They're certainly not very digital. And they do a lot of their business in cash. And whereas cash may be king to some people, for a financier, cash is a problem because you really can't track it without physically being there to know what's going on. And what we need instead, and this is a slide from one of my members, Ant Financial from China, we need more SMEs to be like this, where that transaction at the mom and pop shop is going on with the QR code. And as you heard, Alipay, Ant Financial, My Bank, they're serving millions and millions of Chinese customers now At the same time, you also heard that this is a closed loop platform. It is not a GovStack. Now, China may be making it into that today, and you should all be following that very carefully. But right now, you have several very, very large systems that are all closed loop, and they've managed to reach immense scale in China. Similarly, M-Pesa is also a closed loop system in Kenya, and it's done fantastic things. So the challenge is, how do you balance the innovation of the private sector with the ability of governments to create perhaps more long-term equitable platform solutions? And we're going to talk about that with respect to SMEs, as you already heard, because SMEs not only need to be, sorry for the language here, but you don't need to understand what this is about. They not only to be able to take payments, but they need to be able to manage their financial affairs, their customers, their suppliers. They need to be able to do it on a dashboard like this, and not on the abacus and the disorderly store, and the scraps of paper like you saw earlier. They also, as you heard about Olam in the last example, Olam's a big agribusiness supplier, longtime IFC client, helping farmers around the world get access to markets, but helping a tiny, tiny, tiny fraction of the farmers that are growing those valuable commodities still, despite the advances you've heard about. And that's because this is what marketing is like for most SMEs in the world. It might not look like this, it might not look like a wet market, but it's just as disorderly if you see people doing business in Europe or other places where they're not doing it in wet markets. It's unpredictable, it's not recorded well, and it also makes it harder for SMEs to grow and thrive. And so we need things to be more like this. This is the global supply chain for computers, putting computers together. And it's obviously a graphic representation, but let me tell you, even this doesn't work well for SMEs yet. And let me cite two reasons why. You heard about Swift as a successful example, and please don't quote me on this, but to me, Swift is a decidedly unsuccessful example for SMEs. Why? Swift, when it was formed 40 years ago, used a technology based on telex machines, which it is still using today. Probably many of you on this call are too young, you don't even know what a telex machine is, but if you're a banker and you're doing cross-border interbank transfers, you better know what a telex machine is, because it's still the underlying technology. And it means this is slow, expensive, error-prone, vulnerable, and who suffers from that? SMEs, because bigger companies have corporate treasurers, have other people that can make things happen better. But if you think that's bad, let's look at the fundamental underpinnings of cross-border trade, because they haven't changed, not since the 1920s telex technology. No. They haven't changed since 14th century Venetian trade finance technology. You cannot find a more paper-intensive system today on the planet. You cannot find a more concentrated and controlled. There are 12 banks in the world called the Warburg Group, and they dominate dollar, euro, and yen trade. And they are perpetuating this technology because it's not in their interest to move onward, because they're making such money off the old system. And we make a lot of money off it too in IFC, because we get paid because of the imperfections in this market, and we step in and we help people move forward. But we really need things like this. This is an actual screen from a system that just opened in Peru. It's called the Business Clearinghouse system. It's a lot like some of the examples you heard talked about in concept, which are now there today. And also India, as you heard, has a working system like this, where when any business makes a transaction with another business, it goes through this central clearinghouse, which is a public-private partnership. The transaction clears instantly. The taxes and other obligations are automatically served, so that the businesses that are now informal don't worry about being formal, because they're not going to get visited by a government officer that said, aha, we see you now, and you didn't do your taxes right. No, you owe me money. Not the government, you owe me money. Well, that's not going to happen in Peru, because it's automatically done on the phone, and the person would say, go away. I do it through the Business Clearinghouse, and it's automatically done at the prevailing correct rates, and everything is taken account of. And this data, per the data clearinghouse that you've just heard about, this is a common database that is accessible to all its participants, including financiers who will use this to do assessments of SMEs to third-party credit scoring and other agencies that will help SMEs be better understood, and even through investors, because you're going to be able to take SME borrowings and you're going to be able to bundle them and make them into legitimate securities, as opposed to what, with all due respect, Fannie Mae has a lot to answer for in the US as an American to what happened in the financial crisis. This is going to do really transparent securities that people will understand what they're buying when they buy them, and they're hopefully not going to be, as a result, creating bubbles. So this is where we could be and where I hope we'll be. And as you see, some of the impact, instead of 15 minutes for a transaction, it's going to take 15 seconds. Instead of days to clear things, it's going to take minutes. This is going to be a major, well, this is a major improvement in Peru. It's just open. So watch this space. A year from now, let's talk about the real impact of this on small business life. So to get your money, most important, it's going to take real time. You get your money as a supplier instead of 1 day to 2 weeks. Let me go into the final area, which you also heard touched on by Tamara. We can also use this same digitalization to make SMEs more sustainable. There's a lot of talk about sustainability nowadays, but how much of it really touches SMEs in the base of the pyramid? Almost none. And that's because people aren't paying attention to that, but they should, because just like SMEs account for most jobs, you add all the SMEs together, they account for a lot of the pollution. They account for a lot of the GHGs, and they account for a lot of the social problems, whether those are gender-based labor discrimination, child labor issues, you name it. But we can use this same digitalization and structuring of supply chains to make incentives for SMEs to get better. And so we can use the incentives of the market. And here are 4 examples that IFC has done in the last few years. 1 in the spices, so the food processing industry, and 3 in the garments and sporting wear sector. And this has taken SMEs that when you told them you really need to think about things, how about getting audited, they ran a mile. Now they queue up and say, I want my auditor. I want to have a higher rating. Why? Because I get cheaper money and I get faster money. So I'm going really fast now, but you want to learn more about this? Our flagship annual event is coming up soon, the Global SME Finance Forum. This year it's focusing on greening SME finance. In our tradition of trying to be on top of trends before they're trends, we're going to talk about green financing, but we're going to talk about green financing at the base of the pyramid level exclusively. And that's what's going to make it unique. And the registration is open. I'll put the link in the chat just after I finish here. And I will also put my email if anybody wants to ask for more. And that's it. Here are some ways to find out more about the SME Finance Forum. And now I will stop sharing my screen and put the links that I promised into the system. So hopefully you can see me and not see my screen anymore.
Yes, that's correct. Matt,
so I went really fast, but I'm sorry.
Oh, no, you were amazing and covered so much ground. It's actually so encouraging to see the amount of overlap between today's presentations. I think it's making me feel very hopeful. With that, I'd like to shift gears and bring somebody who's been in the digital transformation field as a senior advisor on digital strategy for the World Bank for many years. And now he's going to be talking about digital transformation in Asia. This will be a longer presentation with a little time for Q&A. Because we've run over, we won't have the newcomer introductions this month, but we will in October. And just as a precursor for October, we've had confirmation that Arvind Gupta from the Digital India Foundation, the India Stack, will be able to share what's going on in India, which is extremely exciting. So Nagi, you're on.
Thank you very much, Maylin, for this opportunity. And I'm really impressed by the lineup of speakers and the amount of coverage. I will spare you, since I'm the last one, from having slides, and I will try to emphasize few major points, because what I have heard has moved from the financial system ecosystem, or the financial services ecosystem, to the innovation ecosystem and maybe SME ecosystem, and then e-government ecosystem, and somewhere in between. And now I wanted to push further to talk about the ecosystem at the national level and maybe even at the regional level in the case of Asia. So my talk is going to be less technical on specific, architecture or technology and so on, and much more holistic about what is a digital ecosystem at the national level may look like, and what are the foundations for the ecosystem, and why that is important. Let me start by saying there are some good news or some bad news. Some of the good news I heard today in these presentations. Certainly, technology and internet has spread quite widely, rapidly, even though more than half of the world still are not necessarily connected adequately to the internet. But despite the major progress, that this is perhaps the technology that no other technology in history has spread that quickly and that fast, especially mobile. However, basic research from the World Bank, from UN organizations, from my work myself in universities and so on, suggests that much of the benefits, promised benefits, are still to be fully realized, even for those who are connected. And that the digital divide still is quite wide, especially if you define the digital divide more than just access to the internet, and more about the capabilities of using it effectively and being able to transform a sector. So what is this disconnect? In my view, a lot of it comes from the fact that common practice at the institutional level, at the sector level, at the national level, and beyond, tend to be primarily focused on access to the technology, and much less on the complementary factors that are necessary to fully effectively utilize the technology. So the notion that we are moving towards an ecosystem, according to the various speakers, is great and very encouraging. However, I don't think this is happening at the national level very easily, let alone beyond that. And part of the reason for that is that we still, a lot of the aid agencies and a lot of the governments are looking for specific interventions, ad hoc interventions, that are really missing an ecosystem view. And so part of the importance of using an ecosystem approach was basically to try to broaden the focus, to go beyond access to the internet, even though that is a very crucial foundation, and begin to look at the synergies and the complementarities between different foundations of a digital economy or a digital transformation ecosystem. Part of the problem for persistence of looking at things in a silo way or separate way is that the institutions that support the digital transformation are fragmented themselves within the country. It is not just the Ministry of ICT or the regulatory agency or Ministry of Science and Technology or Ministry of Small and Medium Enterprises or whatever have you. It is ultimately the interaction between these various leading institutions that shape and manage the ecosystem, and that unfortunately tend to still be difficult and more silo-oriented. Another additional challenge is short-termism of various interventions, including those by aid agencies, with the promise from the suppliers and from the funding agencies that somehow a single solution or a single technology is going to do major transformation on its own. And so, and that a project funded by whatever, the World Bank or IMF or whatever, is going to be able to make major achievements in the transformation. However, in practice, those most successful countries tend to have much longer term commitment for digital transformation, to be realized. Just look at what Singapore has went through from 1980s to now. Several 5-year plans of different, progressively more ambitious, progressively building on earlier learning and so on. So the promise that somehow single intervention or single application is going to go farther in scaling up towards transformation for the whole economy is really an overpromise. What are some of these foundations that I'm talking about? Digital leadership and digital institutions on the one hand. And these are more than the Ministry of ICT or more than the Ministry of Science and Technology, or in the case of the UN organization, is more than the ITU or funding institutions like the World Bank. Even within the World Bank, there is a struggle about how much to address the ecosystem as distinct from just addressing telecom access or an internet access or innovation sector or SMEs and so on. So we need to focus on or to broaden the focus for digital transformation to include digital leadership and institutions, digital policies, both enabling policies that can help competition in the IT sector or help building trust in the digital ecosystem of the country, as well as the safeguards, policy safeguards. The infrastructure, including telecommunication, not only internet access, but also in terms of digital platforms of all kinds. I'll come back to that. Digital skills and competencies, and the digital sector itself as it is oriented to do digital transformation for the economy, as distinct from digital sector for its own progress or for export. I'm talking here about reshaping the digital innovation and digital sector itself to be much more supportive of the broader ecosystem within the country. Why all of that I'm talking about as at the time when I'm supposed to talk about Asia digital transformation strategy. The reason for that is that as an advisor to the Asia Development Bank team that's dealing with the digital transformation at the regional level, we need to draw on some of the best practices. And most of the studies and most of the best practices that we could draw on at the country level, not at the regional level. Maybe the EU have some model there, maybe ASEAN has some model, but in general, this is still fairly weak. And so what I try to do is to draw on best practices research from the experience of various countries. And a lot of it pinpoint to the importance of approaching the issue of digital transformation as an ecosystem approach, as an ecosystem challenge. One or two final points on this overview is that there has been primarily in applications, once you have the foundations right, which usually never is right in a static way, it's always evolving. The importance is really ultimately to apply digital technology to various sectors of the economy, both in the public sector and the private sector. And that tended to be often supply driven by suppliers, by consultants, management consultants, and so on, and much less by being supportive to a sector strategy of the country or supportive to the overall development strategy of the country. So we want to start from the demand side or from the pull side of the sector strategies, like what do you want to do to reform the health sector in the country or the education sector in the country, and what kind of policies, what kind of skills, what kinds of institutions, what kinds of players and ecosystem participants you need to address, in addition to the specific low-hanging fruits of certain applications in that sector. One final paradigm shift under the digital economy is to address issues of how to go about having the strategy, digital strategy of the country being dynamic, being learning oriented, being adaptive. No single rigid digital development plan or digital planning is usually relevant and successful after 1 or 2 years, unless it is being updated and adapted and learning from internal innovations, local entrepreneurship, and so on, to help shape the overall strategy of the country. I wanted to then pick up on a few of these things, and I hope I will be able to cover them quickly. One is, as you said earlier, the digital foundations of the economy, starting with digital leadership and governance. Most important is to start with a digital diagnosis for the whole economy. And that means looking at all elements of the digital ecosystem, both the foundations and the way it's being adopted or applied in various sectors. Unfortunately, digital transformation itself or digital payoff at the national level is very difficult to measure. We have to admit that the state of the art yet has not solved some of these issues. What we ended up usually have is few proxies of what digital transformation in the country is and where are the payoff, usually much better measured at the application level or subsector level or the enterprise level. The challenge for us is to still be able to do a holistic diagnosis based on a whole number of indicators and benchmarks and be able to use that to provide realistic targets for these various foundations to be improved on. Part of the leadership is to help attend to these foundations because they are not as quick wins as the actual applications in a specific sector or subsector. Also, leadership role is to try to develop consensus on the overall vision for digital transformation of the country and make this vision not driven by specific technologies, but by development priorities of the country. Another part of the leadership is to address the longer term thinking or the longer term payoff that comes from dealing with the digital foundations in the economy. And that means not only looking at the low-hanging fruits, which are very important, but also to give sense of urgency to the change needed for digital transformation. You could see from what's happening on the digital, on the COVID-19, and how much it has given some sense of urgency to try to look at the delivery of services, including digital sector transformation and so on. We need that kind of sense of urgency built by the leaders of the country about in what way digital transformation is key to competitiveness in the country, key to the future of the economy of the country, key to more equitable growth and more sustainable growth in the country. In addition, the balance between this longer term and between the quick wins or low-hanging fruits has to be established depending on the conditions of the country itself, whether there is a sense of crisis that needs to be addressed or whether the country has relatively more stable ecosystem or more stable leadership like in Singapore to be able to sustain that commitment over time and invest in the longer term, gestating investment, not only in the shorter term. Leadership and governance, last point I want to make on that foundation is that institutions that deals with leadership in digital leadership requires links to some of the core ministries. Ministry of ICT by itself cannot do it. It really requires links to the Ministry of Economy, Ministry of Finance, other collaborating ministries that deal with the private sector, as well as dealing directly with the private sector and civil society. That requires that there is a clearer division of labor between e-leadership institutions, clear mandate, clear competencies. A Ministry of ICT by itself cannot do it all. A Ministry of Science and Technology cannot do it all. Ministry of SME, local government, central government, and so on. There is a whole of society approach that needs to be carved around digital institutions or leadership institutions so that they will be able together to be able to advance the ecosystem and advance the applications. One important link is need to link the digital leadership institutions to the adopting sectors, what the sectors, the leadership in these sectors would do. Here, the role of the chief innovation officers or chief information officers or e-leaders within various sectors are quite important, and having a network approach between them and between the e-leadership institutions themselves. The second, what you call foundation, I have 5 foundations. The second foundation is the policies, regulations, data, and cybersecurity. Increasingly, data policies are becoming extremely important for a country, for developing countries as well as developed countries. Partly is because there are more and more open data, more and more digitized data, and more private sector activities in this area to add value or to draw value out of this data. So in creating open data, open government data, open standards, opportunities for reusing of open data, open sources, all of that are an important part of the fuel for the ecosystem. And the same thing with other policies related to digital technology, including competition, for example, among telecom operators and internet service providers, safeguards to privacy, against abuse of data and against misinformation and so on. All kind of policy that encourages competition and encourages and promote trust in the digital economy or digital transactions are key to a healthy ecosystem functioning. And the same thing applies to safeguards like cybersecurity. Cybersecurity is increasingly becoming important, including digital resilience and cybersecurity, mainly because this is not an issue that only occupies governments. It's also an issue that affects business and affects individuals. So a whole of society approach to cybersecurity becomes extremely important. Another building block, or actually I call it foundation, is of course the digital infrastructure and the platforms. And that's an area that typically tend to be more obvious to certainly the people-centered internet that was the main motto originally to try to make internet accessible to all. This requires, to start with, still a lot of reforms in the internet access, the telecom reforms, and so on. And in the case of Asia, Central Asia and West Asia, which is the region I'm focusing on now, you find that there is still fairly low level of internet connectivity. A lot of it has been pending on or the result of monopolies in the telecom and a lack of openness to competition among internet providers and among telecom providers. So this is still a long way to go in the digital infrastructure itself. But most important is also the last mile, the link between the backbone and between retail or the connection to the ultimate users. And here, for developing countries, it is important to innovate and experiment with different business models for what you would call business models for shared access, for community information centers, and other means that can make access affordable and yet reliable and mobile, both mobile and broadband. Mobile will be ultimately, but through these shared access centers. Another aspect of the digital infrastructure and platform is the growing importance of digital platforms, including things like digital ID, which you could see the applications for that, whether in Estonia or India or in Singapore, where unique digital ID has become increasingly important, not only to access government services and access to government cash transfer and so on, especially for the COVID, but also because it does provide access to varieties of other financial services and other public and private services. The same thing applies to a number of other platforms that are growing in importance, whether it is e-commerce, e-finance, e-services. And one of the earlier speakers, I think his colleague in IFC, also touched on the issue that many of these platforms tend to be closed and proprietary, and there is a need for interoperability across platforms or other ways to try to address many of the issues exploiting it through digital platforms that are accessible to many players beside the main sponsor or the main player. The fourth foundation is digital skills and competencies. Interestingly enough, while digital infrastructure takes a lot of money and can grab the attention of financial institutions like the World Bank and others, the digital skills and the complementary skills, although it does take a lot less resources, mainly from money-wise, it is really tend to be perhaps the most important and the least attended to in the ecosystem. And here I don't mean skills only for the techies. I'm talking about all the way from digital literacy skills to highly specialized skills, for example, in analytics and data management and so on, as well as cybersecurity and issues of that nature. For that, maybe sometimes countries can, even small countries, especially in developing countries, can be able to pool some of these scarce skills. But more importantly is that the wider range of skills, all the way from systems integration to software development to a whole host of data management to development and so on, all of that requires integrating digital literacy, digital skills, advanced digital skills, and change management skills in the education sector itself and in the enterprises themselves, where large enterprises in particular can provide a major ground for training. And I remember the Tata Consultancy, for example, when they were growing up, they were training a lot more people than what they will be using, on the assumption that many of them will be picked up by many others. One important issue for the developing countries is the brain drain in this area, and how to be able to attract and retain and develop digital talents in ways that can be rewarding to them, particularly in the public sector, where often the public sector is the last option sometimes for IT specialists to apply for or to stay with. It's important to find ways to incentivize these talents to stay in the country and to be able to connect with their peers in the rest of the global community and be able to be up to date without having to migrate or to be lost to the global marketplace. The final foundation is the ICT sector itself, and I would say here mainly that most important is to reorient the private sector development of the digital sector to be more attentive to local transformation, needs in the country, both in the public sector, private sector, and particularly to small and medium enterprises, and even to enable social intermediaries and NGOs to be able to do the kind of advocacy and information sharing that is needed, particularly for the poorer population. Having said many of these things, I have a long list, but I want to stop at the foundations and just say few headings for the rest, which is the need to adopt sector-wide and economy-wide transformation approaches, so that transformation is driven by the overall development priority and strategy of the country and by the various sectors that are articulating their own information needs, transformation needs, before they can pick up whatever suppliers they wanted to satisfy these needs. They have to become sophisticated users in terms of knowing what they need and how these are priorities to support their own sectors. In the government, digital transformation is one aspect that also need to be emphasized, because I find many of the sector strategies that I looked at for digital transformation in many developing countries, sometimes they primarily are thinking of it in terms of what it means for the private sector, for export and for competitiveness. And they tend to neglect the fact that digital transformation of the government is critical for the enabling environment for the private sector, for government to business transactions, for accountability of government, for improving the public sector services that are crucial to many of the population, not only for the top literate people, but for the rest of the population. And because of that, it becomes also a platform for sharing data. It's a platform for partnering for services and so on. Lastly, I would say there are some cross-cutting goals for this ecosystem development. One is overall digital inclusion, which often tend to be neglected in overall development strategies, digital development strategies of the country. The ensuring ownership and participation, because digital transformation is not something that you do for others, it is something that others do for themselves. As much as possible, enabling through participation, through social intermediaries, through small and medium enterprises, through consultations, you'll be able to create forums and ways to get the demand to condition the supply of digital transformation. Finally, one cross-cutting area is learning and innovation. And here I just wanted to say that the best of digital practices that I'm talking about is not cut in concrete. It is continuously being developed and being pioneered by the front runners. And we need to create the forum and the platforms that can help share these best practices, a la what Maylene is doing right now, and be able to create enough experiments within the national strategies to help promote innovation at the local level, not mega innovations, not necessarily the new computers of the world, but more in terms of incremental innovation that adapt the potential of digital technology to the various local contexts of the developing countries. Sorry if I have taken too long. I wanted really to hear any comments and reaction. I would appreciate that.
So because we only have 1 minute left in our time, I suggest, Nagy, that you share your email address so that people can contact you and share many of the comments that were made in the chat. So we are at the end of our time. Thank you, Nagy, for a really good counterweight to all the technology innovation that was discussed earlier. You have brought us home to be people-centered, to be really grappling with the issues that are there for us to face before we can really do the changes that we hope to do.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you, Nagi. Thank you, Matt. Thank you, all our speakers today. Thank you for those who have joined. Sorry, we have no time for newcomers to introduce, but we'll definitely have time next month.
Thank you so
Bye-bye.
much.